Alright, so moving on to Prosth, you're going to need to make your putties. When you make your putties, you're going to need 1, 2, 3, 4 of them. So these will help you see the occlusal reduction. Honestly, I don't think anyone uses this cut particularly much, but they want you to create these, cut them, and then provide them just in case the graders want them. And they'll fit on just like that. You have them for the interior as well. And it'll lock in just like that. When cutting these ones, you want to cut straight down the center. So let's see that. Same thing for the interior. You gotta cut with a little bit of curve on this one. These are a little bit earlier putties that I made. That's using a 12 blade. You'll notice that there's a little bit of irregularity in the cuts. I found out later that buying one of these, we have a very long extendable blade. Once you cut, you'll have a nice and smooth cut as opposed to the slightly jagged cut from the 12. You can buy these on Amazon. There's like 4-pack for super cheap. To check occlusal reduction, axial reduction, and the one that they use mostly for the exam for grading is this one. So when you're making your putties, you want to make sure they are nice and thick, so there's no real flex to them. A lot of times they're made too thin, and you'll just see them flexing quite a bit. What you want is when the putty is on the tooth, you have no flex, it seats firmly, and there isn't much rock. And honestly, it's worth it to make your putty extra thick so it really locks onto your typodon. And you have the ones for the interior, nice and thick, doesn't really flex too easily. Locks on, doesn't rock because it's so thick. Here at school, they restrict the putty a little bit more than other schools, I would suppose. You can always buy your own, but yeah, make a good putty guide. So for this one in particular, people sometimes damage adjacent teeth. Couple of solutions for that are what are called Interguards. That are these thick pieces of metal that you can jam in between the teeth. And this is something you can use on both the Prosth as well as the restorative. So you'll see it kind of just goes right here, in between the teeth. And because the metal is so thick, it takes quite a bit of force to get through it. Obviously, if you're going fast enough, you can. If you're using a diamond, yeah. Just be careful. It's not foolproof, but it gives you cushion for error. The other type of thing that we can use is called a wedge guard. looks like this. Those are available at the 4th floor dispensary as well as the 2nd floor dispensaries. From previous experience, these Interguards are only available during the actual exam itself. They used to provide them for practice, but I think they're about $2, $3 each, so probably why they had to restrict that. There's also just traditional wedging, you know, just a wedge between the teeth, create separation, used an enamel shell. That way you're not hitting the adjacent teeth. And the last thing you can use is called an Interguard. These ones are thicker than the wedge guard, probably a little more expensive, but still less expensive than the Interguards. And you'll see it. It's a very similar to the wedge guard. Just a little bit thicker metal, and the wedge itself is much sturdier because it's a lot more solid. If you remember, the wedge guard has kind of almost a separation between the two, so that you can slide over with the pull. So, just like that. So it'll flex as it goes in between the teeth. So when doing your Prosth and you're using a Interguard or wedge guard or whatever you'd like, just remember that it will change the angulation. A common problem that I've seen is right here at the interproximal of 5 and 6. If you have a wedge right there, sometimes the wedge can move almost distally, and that'll create an illusion that may lead to over taper on the mesial of 5. So for my exam, I just locked in, get a really good finger rest, and then just drive straight through the interproximal, being careful not to hit the other tooth. Then you'll be able to look at the other tooth, see what the angulation is, and match that angulation. You can always taper more towards the distal later, but once you over taper towards the distal, it's really hard to adjust the interproximal enough so that it is not over tapered. So just stay closer to this tooth, just don't hit it. The distal of 3 is another really difficult spot. We're going to be using cheeks like this on our exam. Other schools have different types of cheeks, sometimes a little thicker. Just remember that when you are prepping for a long period of time, your hand is going to get tired. So I'd recommend driving through the distal of 3 a little bit earlier than, doing your gross occlusal reduction, doing your mesial and distal and proximal of 3. I think a good workflow is to do 9, so your hand is nice and warmed up. It's a lot easier of a tooth, it's right there in front of you. And then drive through the distal of 3, drive through the mesial of 5, and then you have the most technical, stressful portions out of the way. Because if you're going to hit the adjacent teeth, that's the most likely time that you can do that. So once you have these two, the mesial of 5 and the distal of 3 refined, you should be in pretty good shape. So sometimes when you're using your KR green for your prepping, you'll create a J margin because you are a little bit too far onto the shoulder. The tip of the KR green is 1.1 at the tip, about 1.5 at the base. So you can use that for depth cuts. You can also use that to measure your shoulder. If you have this burr just riding on the shoulder but not off, you're pretty much at 1 millimeter. That'll also prevent you from getting any J margins because it's wider than your shoulder by 0.1. If you do end up getting a J margin and you need to get rid of it, hand instruments are great. This one is the enamel hatchet. It's got two different sides. It's got a beveled side and a flat side. Flat side is a cutting side. And you can basically just put it right there on that margin and then just shave it smooth. And that's probably the best way that I can think of to get rid of J margins without iatrogenic damage to the adjacent teeth. When you have sharp line angles and you don't really want to, take your burr and put it on a high speed, you can do the same thing and just round it with your diamond course. You can also take an approximal strip, just like this, and then you can use that to just round everything. Just right across the top, right on the sides. Just remember, don't hit your margins. When checking for draw, you're going to want to see all the way around your tooth. See the margins all the way around. See the margins all the way around this one at the same time. You can get a mirror that's almost like an eyelash mirror, I suppose it's called, that has like a telescopic handle. And then you can see both teeth at the same time. If you're using it with just your regular mirror, just try and keep it in the same plane and just slide back and forth. Let me see if I can get that. Just stay in the same plane. One thing that I found that helped me is making sure that I had a very, very strong finger rest. If you can really lock your hand down, you can almost feel like you're a machine, just pivoting in one location. And then you just act like a robot and just drill your tooth. And then this, that same kind of very strong finger rest is going to translate to clinic, is going to translate to the restorative portion as well. So just get that finger rest really strong. One of the tricky parts for me was the cingulum reduction. It actually was more reduction than I thought. So part of that is you want to create a fossa, because the natural tooth has a fossa, and use a football. That way when you measure with your putty guide, you're able to measure accurately into that fossa. If you keep it straight across, it'll always look under-reduced, and it probably is under-reduced because you don't have that natural curvature on the inside of the tooth. Other thing is making sure you have that 1 millimeter cingulum height. In order to do that, you can always drop your shoulder and just make sure your shoulder is nice and smooth, and that'll give you that extra cingulum height. It's okay if the tooth is thin, as long as you have enough reduction on the mesial, on the facial, and on the lingual. For occlusal reduction, what helped me was to use a 330 burr. 330 burrs are 1.5 millimeters. And what I would do is I would just make a bunch of holes that are 1 millimeter deep, pretty much everywhere. Then I would take my round football and then just kind of plane everything down until I could see those little holes. And then by the time I remove those holes, I was at 1 millimeter everywhere. After that, you just use your putty guide to just kind of refine a little bit, get a little bit past 1, because you never want to be on the edge of that, that acceptable limit. You want to be a little bit past, so that way they don't have to pull out an instrument and check. The best thing you can do is just make everything look nice, clean, and easy to read, because the less work they have to do, the better off you'll be. And yeah, I think that's just about everything for Prosth.